Welcome to Nurture KC's inaugural podcast. I'm Tracy Russell. I'm the Executive Director at Nurture KC, and we are thrilled to be launching this. And I really view this podcast as the final piece to our communications efforts to really tell the story of Nurture KC, why we're here, what we do, and put it in a way that's conversational and I think in a way that will stick with people going forward. So, who's Nurture KC? We are a local nonprofit in Kansas City with the mission of improving maternal and infant health in Kansas City. We have as our flagship program Healthy Start, and we've had that program for nearly 20 years now. And we serve women from the 14 zip codes of Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas, with the highest rates of infant mortality. And we do that through a variety of wraparound services, and we utilize community health workers. So the only qualifications for that program is a woman must live in one of those 14 zip codes, and she must be pregnant upon entering the program. They stay with us until that child is 18 months old, at which time we do a warm handoff to other organizations in the city that will continue to make sure that we've got a healthy baby and family. Another program that we have is the Mid-America Immunization Coalition, or MAC for short. And through MAC, we advocate and educate on behalf of the importance of immunization to our overall health. And with that one, we cover a broader geographic area. So in Missouri, we have Jackson, Clay, and Platte counties, and then Johnston and Wyandotte counties on the Kansas side. And we do everything from free flu clinics each fall to providing legislators with information about the importance of vaccination and everything in between. Then we have our Fetal Infant Mortality Review Committee, also known as FEMR for short. And FEMR is really a community-facing group. And so they're looking at infant and fetal deaths from the zip codes that we serve and looking to identify trends in those deaths so that we can prevent and reverse those trends going forward. They take their recommendations and hand them off to our community action team to implement those changes across the city. And then finally, our newest program is Promise 1000. Promise 1000 just moved over to Nurture KC in September of 2022, and it has very similar goals to Healthy Start in terms of providing those wraparound services to young families. The one difference being Promise 1000 is a home visiting model exclusively, so community health workers are meeting these families in the home, and we have several organizations that participate in that through a collective impact model. So in total, Nurture KC has really the largest footprint in the city when it comes to maternal and infant health in Kansas City. So I know I've spent some time on programming here today, and actually the topic for this first podcast is going to be on nonprofits and political involvement. And I will say that I believe that policy piece is as important as the service piece that we do. And in fact, we not only have a right to do it, but an obligation to do it. And on our website, we have a quote that I think really sums it up for me, and we're going back to the ancient Greeks here. But Pericles said, just because you do not take an interest in politics doesn't mean politics won't take an interest in you. And I think that's absolutely true, and particularly in today's times where so many of the issues that impact our families are being decided at that state house. And it's really incumbent upon us to bring about that widespread change and change the culture around these issues so that we're not only impacting the families we serve, but we're impacting Missourians and Kansans in general. And I know that there can be a lot of hesitancy around that political piece when it comes to nonprofit work. And I hope that today I can dispel a little bit of that and show you what we do at Nurture KC to participate in the public square. And I come from a background of being a lobbyist for over 25 years. And so I have seen firsthand what these laws, how these laws impact what ultimately become the circumstances for the families we serve. So I want to talk a little bit about what lobbying is and what it is not. So most nonprofits are going to be categorized as a 501c3. That is an IRS designation. It means that you have tax exempt status for the charitable work that you're doing. So with that comes some caveats and restrictions on political activity. Let's put this into two buckets. One is kind of the lobbying piece, and the other is the elections and kind of partisan piece. I will say that as a 501c3, you can't really engage on the election side as an organization. In other words, you can't endorse a candidate. You can't have a political action committee. Okay, so we'll set that piece aside. The lobbying piece is different. So the IRS establishes both a financial standard as well as a time standard. And so what the IRS says is a substantial part of your work cannot be lobbying. How do they define that? So when it comes to revenue, if your organization has revenues totaling $500,000 or less, if you expend up to 20% of that or $100,000 on lobbying, that's a substantial piece. So you basically have to stay below that threshold. And then those amounts go up depending on your revenues. Okay. The less defined aspect is how much of your time can be dedicated to lobby. That's a little bit more vague and really is, it just can't be the substantial piece of the work you do. Okay, so that's the first kind of structural hurdle. The second structural hurdle for nonprofits is many receive their funding through foundation grants. Well, foundations can't engage in lobbying, so they will often put that restriction on the nonprofit that funding cannot be used for that purpose. Okay, so as we walk through this, I think it's important to have a definition of exactly what constitutes lobbying, because I think that's where the disconnect occurs. There are all sorts of activities that you can engage in that don't actually meet the definition of lobbying. And I'll read just a few of those. So, lobbying is not nonpartisan analysis, study, or research. Lobbying is not a discussion of broad social and economic problems. Lobbying is not sharing a point of view. And lobbying is not sharing on a volunteer basis a position on a bill. Okay? And I think that's really the focus that we need to look at. Being able to convey a position on an issue based on your real life experience with the people that you work for, based on the data that's been collected, is not lobbying. It's sharing your expertise at a time when that's really needed with decision makers. I think our ability to relate how it impacts the clients we serve is something that lawmakers need to hear about. It is that storytelling piece that's so tangible and resonates with decision makers. And we have an obligation to convey that. And so I am hopeful that as we move forward and you see more nonprofits getting involved in the public square and choosing to weigh in and say, hey, here's what the impact will be if you adopt this policy. Lend your expertise and lend your heart to what you see the result to be for the families that you serve. At Nurture KC, we do establish a legislative agenda each year. And as a rule of thumb, I keep that agenda very focused. There has to be a direct correlation to maternal and infant health for us to engage. And then kind of my other consideration is this a timely issue? Do we expect to see activity and action around this issue during the upcoming legislative session? If we meet those criteria, then chances are that's going to make it to my legislative priorities. That doesn't mean we don't track and monitor other bills, because certainly we do, and you can't always predict what's going to arise that may become a priority issue for you. But before the legislative session, when we establish those issues, those are what we look for. So in Missouri this year, what our top two priorities are extending postpartum coverage for women in Medicaid. Currently, the law ends eligibility at 60 days postpartum. What this legislation would do is extend that to 1 year. We know that many issues don't present in that initial 60 days, and in fact, over half of maternal deaths are occurring after that period has expired. The second issue is really a defensive one, and it is to protect the current childhood vaccine schedule in Missouri. We also have that same priority in Kansas, as we've seen kind of an onslaught of bills over the last 3 years or so that would seek to dilute those requirements. And these are the vaccines that kids need to enter school, and that we know have had such an impact in disease prevention through the 20th century into the 21st century now. The other priority in Kansas is to have Medicaid cover self-monitoring blood pressure. So in other words, your blood pressure cuffs. We see a lot of pregnant women experiencing preeclampsia, and these blood pressure cuffs can be the first sign of that, so that we can get them treated and physicians become aware of it before it hits that crisis stage. So we consider that a very important issue, and we are working with the American Heart Association on that. So those are our top priorities for the 2023 session. We've actually hit the midpoint in these legislative sessions. And with me today, I have two guests. We have Camera Meany, who is the Director of Government Relations for University Health, and Reagan Cusimano, who is the Director of Governmental Affairs for the University of Kansas Hospital System. And with full disclosure, both of these ladies do serve on our board. Reagan is our chair, and Camera is our chair-elect. And I'm thrilled to have them today. They are both regulars in their respective state houses and just bring a breadth of experience and expertise to our conversation today. So we're going to move into our next segment, and up first is Camera Meany. And Camera and I have known each other for 4 years now, and she really fights the fight on behalf of maternal and infant health in Jefferson City. And Camera, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what drew you to the political arena and these issues in general?
So I had no intention of going into government relations or politics. I was going to be a history professor, but I went to grad school at Marquette, where they have this strong social justice thread that goes through everything that you do there. And I really started tapping into the community and the community needs. Came back to Kansas City and recognized that those needs were present where I had grown up as well. And then I had a baby. And before I had my son, we suffered a miscarriage, and I experienced what it's like to, one, have that loss, but also try to navigate a system that isn't conducive to those conversations and that form of healthcare. And that's a problem for, half of the population. And I became very passionate about what should this look like? How can we do better? And then as a woman of color, it's a whole nother level of how we experience things and how we're heard and how we're not heard. So it just became something, especially working at University Health, where our patient population is just different than any other hospital in the state. And someone needs to speak for those people.
Now, it really is, an issue that is in particular a problem in Missouri. But I think, being willing to engage and take action and care enough about it really speaks to your dedication to this. And I would just go back to, we often hear the term lobbyist and think, well, that's no good. But what we forget is so many of these public interest lobbyists who really are in this for the right reasons to make things better. And so I certainly appreciate everything that you do. So let's get down to Missouri, and lots of activity and action, some good, some not so good. But can you just start by laying some foundation for us and talking about kind of this, what the reception is to maternal and infant health in Missouri right now?
So, over the last few years, I think COVID had a lot to do with this, but I think you've seen a significant amount of growth in the interest in reducing the maternal and infant mortality rates within the state. So, to level set a bit, Missouri is the sixth worst in maternal mortality and morbidity in the nation. 70% of the counties in Missouri either don't have or have a limited access to OB care. The average preterm birth rate of 12%, I mean, that's above the national average. But in some counties, I'd say specifically in the Boot Hills, in Northeast Missouri, Scotland County, Knox County, those preterm birth rates can get as high as 31%. And then I think the most startling piece of it is 50% of the maternal deaths that happen in our state happen 60 days after postpartum. And so many of those are preventable. And we've started to see this national interest on maternal health in general and this hyper focus on areas where it's just not done well. And Missouri, unfortunately, has been under that microscope. And so I think it's garnered a lot of attention from national leaders, but our state house leaders, local levels. And then, the governor really took a stand in his State of the State last month and made maternal mortality one of his priorities. And that's something I didn't expect to happen. I'm very happy it did, but it's something that I think has just got the attention of both sides of the aisle. Now, how will it come out and how will it end at the end of the day? That's a completely different story. But for right now, you see both sides coming together to try to address this issue.
Right. And for Nurture KC, of course, our top priority in Missouri is to extend postpartum coverage in Medicaid. Currently, that limit is at 60 days. These moms are falling off coverage. And what we would see is that extended to 1 year, that they're eligible for that coverage, that continuous coverage. And, as you referenced, we're seeing a majority of these maternal deaths occurring after that coverage has expired. And so it's so critically important, particularly around mental health concerns that don't necessarily present right away. So we all know there was a bill last year that would have accomplished that task. It fell just short. Can you tell us what's going on with the postpartum coverage legislation right now, and look into your crystal ball and tell you where you think we might land?
I try not to make predictions about what will happen in the capital of the great state of Missouri, but we entered session with over a dozen bills filed from both Republicans and Democrats in both the House and the Senate with the intention of, like you said, extending Medicaid from 60 days postpartum to 1 year postpartum, including one that was filed by the Missouri House Floor Leader, Representative and Dr. John Patterson. And when all of these were filed, we knew we had governor support. We really thought that this would be a light lift. And I will say, in the House last week, four of those bills went through. There was three presented by Republican representatives, one by a Democrat representative. They all went through no problem. There was zero opposition. There was a committee room full of individuals and organizations testifying in favor of those bills. And so I left the Capitol that day with a lot of hope and excitement that this was going to happen, that it would happen rather quickly. On the Senate side of things, Senator Elaine Gannon, who I will say we should all give credit for really pushing this issue the last 2 years, introduced a similar bill extending Medicaid. It was in committee. It seemed like it was, again, going to be a light lift, but we've had some new language introduced by a pair of conservative Republican senators that are seeking to make it clear that women who have abortions cannot receive the extended postpartum benefits. And for anyone who pays attention to what happens in Jeff City, specifically the Senate, they know there might have been a little bit of dysfunction last year, a lot of filibustering. We know the strength of the conservative senators there. And so there are some concerns being raised that should this new language get through, that it could really run afoul of some federal guidelines and cause CMS, who ultimately has to give the green light on whatever proposal the state of Missouri presents for Medicaid extension, since it's a joint state federal program, CMS could delay or reject the plan altogether. And we know this is possible. We see it happening in Texas right now. It's that, that abortion hot button again. And it's unfortunate, but if I were to look at my crystal ball, we don't get out of this without that language in the Senate. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that is not what happens. But I have a hard time seeing it not play out that way, given the current climate in regards to other hot button political issues right now.
Okay. Well, and we're certainly hopeful that we'll get it through in as clean a form as we can. And I think what's been interesting about this issue in general is just the incredible bipartisan support for it. I mean, you just don't see this in the divisive environment that we're operating in right now in the political world. And so, hopefully the majority will triumph in this case, but stay tuned and we'll certainly keep everyone apprised as it continues through the process. Wanted to switch gears just a little bit to an issue that at first glance may not seem to be of particular relevance to us, but ultimately is. And that is, in Missouri, you have a ballot initiative. And that allows basically petitions to come before the vote of the electorate, kind of bypassing the legislature. I know that there have been some attempts to modify what that process is, and that's how Medicaid expansion was done in the state of Missouri. So clearly some relevance for issues that we care about. Camera, can you talk a little bit about what's going on with that and what those ramifications might be?
Yes. So the initiative petition process, we've seen a lot of bills come out of that over the last 5 years, from Right to Work to Clean Missouri to the most recent with recreational adult marijuana usage. And most prominently, I'd say Medicaid expansion. And although there was a fight after that, that was a significant blow to the majority party. And we have heard the majority party say that these initiative petitions don't align with their platform, regardless of the fact that that's what the voters have passed. And I don't think we should fool ourselves that after the fall of Roe last June, and after what we saw in the state of Kansas last fall, that there isn't some fear that the right to an abortion is going to go to the voters of the state of Missouri. And I think there's some concern that the voters will approve the right to have an abortion. So you've seen the efforts. It started last year. It's really gained traction this year as one of the key elements of their culture war legislation. And that's just to change the initiative petition process. And so you've seen it on a lot of different fronts. You've seen it from, the threshold of voters. So right now it's a simple majority, so 50% plus one, and the petition, passes, fails, what have you. We've seen them introduce bills that say it has to be 60% of the individuals who vote. We've seen it where it has to be 50% plus one of all registered voters in the state of Missouri. So the 4 million registered voters, 2 million plus one would have to show up and they'd all have to vote in favor. We've seen it to where you have to have a certain percentage of signatures from each county. So there's a lot of different bills at play here, just to make the initiative petition process more difficult. And I will say from the Republican side, their argument really is that the Missouri Constitution is too large and that we're constantly adding things to the Constitution. And if we want to make a change later on down the road, it's the hurdle to get there is going to be so much more difficult. So that's the excuse they're using in public. We also hear them saying that the voters are being confused. There's ballot candy, those sorts of things as well. So just a lot of back and forth here between what the voters should be allowed to do and what they shouldn't. And I do expect something to pass. I don't know what it'll look like at the end of the day. I also expect, like Medicaid expansion, for there to be, a slew of lawsuits that follow whatever it is that passes. So again, it's one of those things where we'll just see what they have time to accomplish.
Now, with any changes to that process, could that just be passed via a bill, or would that have to be put to a vote to actually change the ballot initiative process?
We believe that would all have to go to a vote. So the ironic part would be that a simple majority would have to approve whatever change they want to make. But then moving forward, it'd have to be 60% of those individuals to approve changes. Now, there is some question on some language of some of the introduced bills that it could just go through the legislature. But again, the expectation is that there would be lawsuits that would follow that would override any bills that are passed within the House and or the Senate.
Okay, definitely we'll keep an eye on that as well. Are there any other issues on the horizon that you think might be of particular interest as it relates to maternal and infant health?
We've seen some talk about expansion with CHIP benefits. We've heard some interesting bills proposed by the majority party about simplifying the SNAP, Medicaid application process into one application instead of, the various ones that individuals have to apply for. We know there's issues with the backlog in Missouri for processing those applications. One thing that people may not really put in the same category as some of this, but I certainly do, is sales tax exemptions for diapers and feminine hygiene products. I think this it seems like a little bit of money, but I think it's something that is long overdue. And, there's always that abortion conversation and what does that look like? And again, we're not sure what comes out of that. But at the end of the day, I think it is important to note that whatever it is, it does impact maternal health. It does impact maternal and infant mortality. So it's just something we should all keep our eye on. There's a lot of things that happen in Jefferson City that I just think people don't pay attention to because it's not readily available to them. My hope is that through this conversation and other conversations that, folks read the Missouri Independent one morning a week and really see what is being discussed in the Capitol.
I think you make an excellent point. Just being informed is a step in the right direction because I think, in both states, being in the Capitol itself can be very intimidating. It's a very insular place. There's a lot of decorum behind what goes on, and you definitely realize you're an outsider if you're not a daily presence in either of these state houses. And so, I think if there are ways where we can make it more accessible for folks to engage, whether that's, sending an email to their legislator about an issue of concern or meeting with them when they're back in their home districts. These lawmakers have legislative coffees, they're only in session during the winter and spring months of the year. There are opportunities outside of the more formal process that we've come to know. So thank you for that, and keep up the fight for us in Missouri, Camera. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to share more about it.
All right, so we're going to switch over to Kansas, and Reagan is here to talk with us about another pressing issue. And this is a big issue in both states, but it seems as though there's been a little bit more momentum behind it on the Kansas side. And in full disclosure, Reagan and I were once partners in crime. We worked together about 15 years ago in the Kansas State House, and our paths just continue to cross. I'd like to think that's by design, but it's happened nonetheless. And so, Reagan, we're going to talk a little bit about immunization policy in Kansas and what that has looked like, particularly over about the last 3 years or so. And last year, Nurture KC commissioned a public opinion poll in Kansas just to gauge Kansans' support for those routine vaccinations. So what we're talking about is what we need for kids to enter school. So measles, rubella, pertussis, meningitis, hepatitis, and there's what we found was an overwhelming majority of Kansans support those routine vaccine requirements. And we took this poll at what was really the height of COVID, and I would say the height of COVID backlash. And when we commissioned that poll, I will tell you, I was extremely nervous about what those results were going to look like because we just didn't know. And that was really our whole rationale for doing it was we need to know what Kansans are thinking. We need to figure out in the public health space if we need to be adapting messages and doing more outreach. And we were pleasantly surprised to find that 95% believe that vaccines are important to good health. 94% believe vaccines are even more important to good health than visiting the doctor annually. I mean, this support crossed party lines, it crossed regional lines. So we're talking rural Kansans, urban and suburban came together to support. It crosses gender lines, educational lines. I have not seen an issue that's garnered more broad support than this one, which is why it becomes more baffling in terms of what we see going on in the State House. So, Reagan, can you talk to us a little bit about what the perceptions are of support for vaccination at the State House?
Sure. And I just wanted to say thank you for having the idea to commission that particular poll. I do believe at a time when you had a lot of momentum around schedule or the immunity, that you really ended up kind of pivoting some of the positions that some legislators had around immunization, and that polling really helped them feel comfortable with where they were and feel less pressured by their party leaders to kind of stick with a certain narrative. This year in 2023, it's been a little bit less of a chaotic year around immunizations. There's been less of a discussion around those very that very basic list that you went through. So we are not having to push that issue as much as we've had to in the past, and discuss those. But there still seems to be a small group of the majority that still believes that immunizations are not necessarily something that all children should have. We've spent a lot of time talking about why it's necessary for children, and especially for protection of those who are immunocompromised, and just the overall, yes, I would say, education. It was, you might disagree, Tracy, but I don't think you will. But there was just a lot of re-education by Nurture KC with the Kansas legislature, with KDHE, about why we have those and what those are, what those immunizations are. So, it's been a little bit quieter this year. I think as long as we have kind of that smaller group still present the legislature, it's something that will always be on our radar as long as we continue to have those people still in that particular chamber.
Well, in Reagan, I think this really goes back to the earlier point we were making, that even if you don't like politics, it's going to find you. I never dreamed that we would be talking about very common vaccines that really have been the pillar of preventive health in this country for over 100 years, in the political arena, and that there would actually be dissension on that particular topic. So, you can never predict what's coming. And I would agree with you. It almost feels like we've kind of hit that zenith with the anti-vaccine sentiment. And I'm hoping that we'll see a bit of a reset with that going forward. That's my hope. So, can you give just some general advice to nonprofits and how they might engage in the political process? What value you think that they bring, and if they're important to that process?
Absolutely. So, as Tracy said before, she and I have crossed paths many times. First, both working for the state, and then luckily, both of us working for two different not-for-profits. And there's definitely, in my eyes, there's a story that not-for-profits, especially those like the American Cancer Society, Cancer Action Network, and the Heart Association, there's a story that they tell, and I think it's true with Nurture KC as well. There are stories and personal experiences that we get to see on the other side with those organizations that not everybody gets to see. And when those stories can be shared, and the progress that has been made can continue to be made, those types of testimony and the opportunities to share that, I think really those do make a difference with legislators. I think they will tell you that personal stories are very important to them to understand the impact of policy on their individual constituents and how they're positively or negatively impacted. I think not-for-profits, especially who gather a lot of data, for example, the poll that Nurture KC did, as well as health information and those types of things, that is typically very helpful, especially if you can show that you are a nonpartisan group who is not looking to cater to a particular side, but just simply sharing information and data that you've collected over time to a really honest impact to policy.
No, I think that's a really good point. And we often say legislators act from personal experience. I would say the second best reason they act is from the experience of others. And it's really up to those of us who are in that direct service world to be able to convey what the impact is. And here's what this policy is going to mean for this mom and her baby. And the better able we are to deliver those messages and make them resonate, I really think it results in better policy overall, because they can't act on something if they're not hearing all of the information. And so it's important to be engaged in that way. And just going back to the poll for a moment, I think that's a prime example of providing information that is not lobbying. It is the collection of data that then is shared based on the organizational expertise, and that we do, in fact, have an obligation to do that as a nonprofit. So, Reagan, thank you for all you do. I'm convinced we are going to be working with each other through retirement, and that's a good thing. And
That's okay.
I'm so that's right. I'm so happy to have you as chair of my board, as well as that daily presence in the State House. So thanks to both you and Camera for joining today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yes. As we wrap up, I want to give just a couple of more calls to action. I would encourage you to join Nurture KC. You can check us out at www.nurturekc.org. What that gets you is access to our members page, where we post all of this legislative information. So you can track any bill of interest. You can see what our legislative priorities are. You can see at the end of the session what happened with those bills that we claimed were so important. We give a rundown at that at the end of the session. So encourage you to do that, as well as we are going to have another podcast next quarter. This one will be a bit of a pivot from what we've done today, in that we're going to take a deeper dive at the programming we do. So first up will be our Healthy Start program, and our program director, Shannon Williams, will be joining me for that, along with some of our community health workers. Please follow us and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We welcome any comments or questions, and we're always available here and appreciate your support. Thanks, everybody.